Hi, I'm Deborah Fox, the author and illustrator of The Man Who Beat Death Valley, a graphic novel. In this video, I'll be talking about what happened to William Lewis Manley after his heroic rescue from Death Valley. William Lewis Manley's name is spread across Death Valley. The valley floor was once a prehistoric lake called Lake Manley. Manley's friends, John Rogers and Asa Hale Bennett, also have their names atop some of the peaks overlooking Death Valley. Manley, Rogers, and Bennett were part of a collective group known as the Death Valley 49ers, who, in a disastrous shortcut to California in 1849, became the first white settlers to discover Death Valley. Manley, Mr. Bennett, and Mr. Arkin are responsible for Death Valley's foreboding name. William Lewis Manley was part of California's gold rush story and was an early settler. Manley's story is a fascinating one for folks who not only enjoy and love California history, but love hero stories full of drama and adventure. First, I'd like to talk a little bit about the Death Valley 49ers. They were about roughly 100 people of Captain Jefferson Hunt's wagon train headed from Salt Lake, Utah to Los Angeles in 1849. Most of the Death Valley 49ers were bachelors from different parts of the Midwest and South. There were 4 families as well: the Breyer family, the Wade family, the Arkin family, and the Bennett family. Shortly after leaving the Salt Lake area, a bogus map circulated the wagon train showing an imaginary shortcut to the gold fields of California. The Death Valley 49ers left the Hunt wagon train and took it. It was a deathly mistake they came to regret. The Death Valley 49ers couldn't agree on a route and splintered into smaller groups. They all went in the same general direction, but all got lost and starved in the Great Basin Desert. Just when their predicament couldn't get any worse, it did. Mistaking Telescope Peak atop the Panamint Mountains of Death Valley for the Sierra Nevada, they instead plunged into the sink of Death Valley. Some did not survive the ordeal. The Bennett and Arkin families, despite their best efforts, could not navigate out of Death Valley. Manley and Rogers walked 500 miles to Santa Clarita near Los Angeles to get supplies and food, then back to Death Valley to save the 2 families from starvation. After Manley and Rogers heroically rescued the families from Death Valley, the group arrived at the rancho in Santa Clarita, where they were relieved from starvation. From Santa Clarita, the Arkin family, who had better financial resources, left for San Pedro and took a ship to Northern California. The Bennett family, John Rogers and William Lewis Manley, continued on to Pueblo de Los Angeles. They camped near the Los Angeles River. There, Bennett was recognized by the Moody family, who had fortunately chosen to stay on the Old Spanish Trail with Captain Jefferson Hunt. They arrived in Los Angeles a full 6 weeks before the Bennetts did. The Moodys took the Bennett family into their camp, and John Rogers and Manley went into the center of the Pueblo and looked for work. Meanwhile, Bennett had sold his rifle, obtained a wagon, and another yoke of oxen. Moody urged Bennett to join them on their trip up to the mines of the western Sierra Nevada. John Rogers agreed to drive Bennett's team of oxen. Thus, the group left Manley behind in Los Angeles. Manley said he felt quite lonesome after they all had left. Manley decided to work for a month, gaining some income before heading north, and he found work at a boarding house. After 2 weeks, a couple of older gentlemen stopped in at the boarding house. They were driving horses north to Sacramento, and Manley saw this as an opportunity to head north with some company. So he quit his job and prepped for the long journey north. The 2 older men led Manley and a few other men who had joined the group north along the California Mission Trail. Manly was quite awestruck seeing the Pacific Ocean for the first time. He described the waves crashing on the beach and the sun setting on the horizon. He wondered why the ocean was so salty with all the many freshwater rivers pouring into it. At San Jose, the two men leading the group concluded the trip and demanded payment from all who had joined them. Manly vehemently protested. After all, Manly's faithful one-eyed mule hauled the group's provisions, and Manly ate his own food, which he had shared with the group. Wanting to avoid a violent conflict, he reluctantly gave the men almost all of the money he had. In San Jose, Manly surprisingly ran into John Rogers. Rogers led Manly to the Bennett and Moody camp, and they were all reunited. It was May 12, 1850. The following day, John Rogers left to join a group of men he had met camping nearby. This would be the last time Manly would see Rogers for several years. Moody and the others decided to stay longer in San Jose, while Bennett was quite anxious to get to the mines. Manly went with the Bennetts, and they all headed into the Sierra foothills. The group followed the Merced River east into the Sierra foothills and stopped close to where some men were placer mining. Manly and Bennett were completely ignorant how to mine gold, but a friendly Missourian named Williams taught Manly how to use a gold pan. Traveling along the Sierra foothills, they went to areas that were rumored to be rich, but often they didn't exist. They went to Coloma and then finally to Georgetown, about 55 miles northeast of Sacramento. Bennett went to Sacramento to resupply the group, but returned when Manly found prospects. Manly found some good land to work near Georgetown. In Canyon Creek, Bennett and Manly successfully worked several claims. While at Georgetown, Manly witnessed lots of drinking, gambling, fights, and vigilante justice. Manly recounts this episode. A man had drunk his gold's worth of money. Then he demanded his wife's money to drink away as well. The wife did quite well as a laundress in the camp and was popular. When she refused to give her husband her money, the man shot her dead. This didn't suit some of the folks of Georgetown, so the husband was hunted down and vigilante justice was meted out when he was hung from a tree. Manly's writings are full of colorful stories from the early California mining days. Manly soon earned about $2,000 in gold. However, his claim was getting exhausted, so Manly decided to return to Wisconsin and give his difficult farmland there another try. Manly had a tearful goodbye with his close friends, the Bennetts, and left. He found a traveling companion who was also going back to Wisconsin. On November 29, 1850, less than a year after the arduous trek through Death Valley, Manly stepped onto a steamership to Panama. The voyage was dreadful. It was crammed with seasick people, many of whom died and were given a quick burial at sea. The ships offloaded passengers on the west coast of Panama. Manly's description of the experience was fascinating. The people, the animals, the food, the weather, and the landscape were all so new and strange to him. People who paid for cabins on the ships got horses or mules to ride upon across the isthmus. Since Manly had not paid for the luxury, he and his companion walked on foot across Panama. The walk was muggy and swampy. Manly was carrying around 10 pounds of gold, which made him worry about being robbed. The hot, swampy hike made the gold feel burdensome. They boarded a steamer to Havana. Manly says he was quite eager to get away from Panama. In Havana, they went ashore. While there, the two met a man who tried to ply them with alcohol and led them to a deserted alleyway. Manly and his traveling companion were wary of the vulnerable situation they were in, and they said goodbye and quickly headed back to the ship. Another ship came into port, which was headed for New Orleans. Since the one they were on was going to New York, Manly realized the other ship would get the two closer to home faster, so they boarded the ship to New Orleans. Manly was disappointed to find Mineral Point pretty dead. Many people had left, and the shops were closed. He could not find any work. It was winter time, February. Manly also couldn't sell his land for what he had paid for it. The area was depressed. Manly stayed with a family he knew. Laid in by bad weather, Manly wrote his first autobiography of his westward journey, a 300-page letter which he sent to his parents. Tragically, the letter burned up in a house fire, and Manly resolved to forget the difficult westward chapter of his life forever. Manly went to visit a friend, Robert McLeod. Manly told McLeod of his adventures in California, and enticed McLeod soon became eager to leave for California as well. Manly said it didn't take much for McLeod to convince Manly to go with him. So off they went, leaving Mineral Point for California. Manly had stayed in Wisconsin for less than 4 months. The men made their way to the mines near Downieville, and near there, Manly worked an abandoned shaft and found a gold rock that weighed almost 4 ounces. The men continue working on this claim throughout the winter of 1851-1852. They also worked on the middle fork of the Yuba River and ended up making a decent profit. Manly and his friends moved around from claim to claim for a bit, until they claimed and named Moore's Flat. A man came into camp with a pretty wife and daughter, and they ultimately decided to name it after that man. Manly wrote, quote, "We gave Mr. Moore the honor of having a prospecting town named after him because he was the first man to be on hand with a wife." When winter came, Manly didn't want to be in the snow, so he left his claim in the hands of others and made his way to Sacramento. He notes there was a bad storm and the streets were flooding. This was probably the winter of 1853 and 1854. Curious about California's government, he went to see the state legislature in session. There, he came across Captain Jefferson Hunt, leader of the wagon train which the Death Valley 49ers left to take the disastrous shortcut through Death Valley. Jefferson Hunt had settled in San Bernardino for the LDS Church and organized the creation of San Bernardino County and became a state legislative representative from that area. Manly kept traveling on, hoping to find a dry area. He went south to Stockton. There, in a livery stable, he came across his old train boss, Charles Dallas. Dallas, whom Manly disliked, ran the wagon train that Manly joined for the Great Plains section of his journey west. Manly says Dallas didn't recognize him, but loudly blathered on about horse racing to some folks. Manly said, quote, "He didn't care much for his friendship and left without a word," unquote. Manly then took a boat to San Francisco. Since he didn't like that city very much, he decided to board a schooner to Los Angeles. In Los Angeles, he looked up an old companion, W.M. Stockton. Stockton had squatted an orchard near Mission San Gabriel. Manly went to work on the land in exchange for room and board. He also bought half of Stockton's stock animals, some horses, oxen, and some cows. Mrs. Stockton helped Manly learn Spanish. Manly went to San Bernardino to expand his herd and came across Captain Jefferson Hunt again. Hunt warmly welcomed Manly into his home for dinner and sat at the table with 2 of Hunt's wives. Manly noticed his herd was being pilfered by lawless thieves in the area, so he decided to start his journey north again. It was spring, 1854. By coincidence, Manly met John Rogers, his fellow rescuer of the families and Death Valley 49er in San Mateo. It had been 4 years since they had seen each other. The two had a very warm reunion, but were not to see each other again for another 40 years. Manly made his way back to his mining claim at Moore's Flat. Finding that everything was running smoothly, he decided to head back to the San Jose area. Rogers had told Manly that the Bennett family, whom Manly and Rogers had rescued from Death Valley, had settled at Monterey, near the mouth of the Salinas River. So Manly decided to pay them a visit. After a few days, he went on to visit Mrs. Bennett's father, Dariah Dilley, who was also a friend of Manly's. Manly continued to Santa Cruz, where he met up with the Arkin family, who were also rescued from Death Valley. Mr. Arkin was well known in town and gave Manly a hero's warm welcome. Eventually, Manly returned to the Sierra foothills. On his way, he came across Old Crump, the faithful ox who had carried the family children safely out of Death Valley. Manly stopped and affectionately petted the old ox. A fellow told Manly the animal was revered for his part in California history and was retired from work. In 1855, Manly sought to try his hand at mercantile in Moore's Flat. He bought supplies in San Jose and then brought them to Moore's Flat, where Manly's mining buddies would buy their supplies from him. While running his store, Manly kept his mining claims. One, called Paradise, was very lucrative. In 1857, Dariah Dilley, Sarah Bennett's father, wrote Manly a letter informing him that Mrs. Bennett was near death. Manly rushed to San Jose to be by her bedside, and the two friends had a very emotional reunion and a tearful goodbye. Manly recalled how they struggled against complete despair when they left Death Valley. Sarah wept and commended Manly for his brave and valorous act. Manly sat for a long time with Sarah Bennett. She died the following day. Manly went to her burial at Oak Hill Cemetery in San Jose. Her headstone was nothing more than a wooden board carved with her initials. By 1894, Manly reported the grave was long lost. In December 1858, Manly sold his store at Moore's Flat. Manly started a business buying gold directly from the miners. He sold that business in 1859. In 1859, William Lewis Manly bought a 250-acre farm in San Jose, a little over a mile from where Sarah Bennett was buried. In late 1860, Asahel Bennett, who was now in the San Bernardino area, invited Manly on a Death Valley prospecting trip. Manly was unable to make it from San Jose in time to go with Bennett, so Bennett went without him. Bennett and his friends went with a man named Charles Alvord. Most of the men were lazy miners, choosing to prospect close to camp. Not Alvord. Alvord went off on his own for 2 weeks, and when he returned, piled his rocks with all the others. All except one sample, which he had secreted away. When the men returned to civilization, they had their rocks assayed. They were worthless. But surreptitiously, Alvord had his secret rock assayed, and it turned out to be very rich. Alvord told Bennett about the wonderful find, but the secret wasn't kept for long. Some of the men that went on the trip were angry Alvord had held out on them and insisted that Alvord take them back to share his find. Thus, a second prospecting trip was planned back to Death Valley. This second prospecting trip to find Alvord's rich ledge ended up a disaster. Alvord could not find his rich ledge. The snow was lower in the mountains, and he couldn't recognize the area where he had found the rock. Some in the group grew furious and wanted to hang Alvord on the spot. Instead, the group of men, including Bennett, took the best of Alvord's provisions and stock and left him to die of starvation in the Panamint Mountains. When Bennett had returned to Los Angeles, Manley had finally caught up with him. Manley was told about Alvord, and they decided to return to Death Valley to rescue Alvord and prospect more. Bennett and Manley invited a grubstaker named Caesar Twitchell to join them. A grubstaker is someone who trades food or supplies for a stake in the mine. Manley felt a great deal of anxiety about returning for yet another rescue trip to Death Valley. Manley and Bennett, with Twitchell, retraced their arduous exit route out of Death Valley from a decade earlier. Quite unbelievably, Alvord staggered into the men's camp in Redlands Canyon, a remote canyon in the Panamint Mountains of Death Valley. And the four decided to prospect together. When provisions ran low, Bennett and Twitchell returned to Los Angeles to resupply, leaving Manley and Alvord. They never returned. This was the end of Bennett and Manley's 20-year friendship. The two had met in Wisconsin in 1840 and traveled west together. The two mined together in California. Manley had saved Bennett and Bennett's family from Death Valley. Yet Bennett left Manley in the desert, never to see him again. Nearly 30 years later, in 1892, Manley ran into Twitchell in Santa Monica, California. Manley recounts, quote, "The first question I asked him was why he and Bennett left us to starve." Twitchell said the two had hit a snowstorm in the San Gabriel Mountains and concluded that Manley and Alvord had either marched out themselves or had starved to death. So Bennett and Twitchell didn't bother to return, inquire about them, or determine their fate. Manley said, quote, "It required some grace to become reconciled, but we finally forgave them." Bennett passed away in Idaho in 1891. On this prospecting trip, no one struck it rich, and it was the end of a long friendship. However, the one important thing that came out of it was that Death Valley got its name. Manley and Bennett had told Twitchell about their terrible trip across the desert and told him about how their fellow Death Valley 49er, Richard Culverwell, had died in, quote, Death Valley. Twitchell later repeated the name to a Los Angeles Star reporter who put it in print. The name stuck, and Death Valley got its popular name. Manley's autobiographical details start to thin out around 1859 to 1861. However, census data lists him as a farmer from the 1860s through the 1890s. In July 1862, William Lewis Manley married Mary Jane Woods. The couple settled on Manley's farm in San Jose. They did not have children. Not much is known about her. She is mentioned when Manley wrote about a vacation to Yosemite in 1887. The most Manley says about his wife is in a letter dated January 1889. Manley says, quote, "My wife and self are comfortably situated, and to avoid all troubles possible and try and get along as easy as possible." So Manley does not say a lot of details about his wife, Mary Jane. In 1890, the couple moved from his farm to College Park, closer to the center of San Jose. These are photos of their home. Manley had a bad fall in July of 1887. He fell while getting out of his wagon and was knocked unconscious. Thereafter, Manley had to get around with a cane. Friends urged him to write his compelling story down so that it, quote, wouldn't die with him. Manley wrote letters to his fellow Death Valley 49ers in the late 1880s, hoping to refresh his memory. In his letters, Manly apologized for his poor memory and his shaky hand. He referred to death often as, quote, crossing the dark river, unquote. He counted down how many of the original Death Valley 49ers were still alive. The letters reveal Manly got a little crustier as he aged. As he wrote to John Colton in 1894, quote, I have had 2 falls in the past 6 years that nearly put me underground, but they say that I'm something of the mule kind, tough and hard to kill, unquote. So Manly kept his sense of humor. Though Manly continued his correspondences with the Death Valley 49ers throughout the 1890s, they tapered off in the latter part of the decade. In 1877, Manly dictated his first account of his trip west to a reporter, which was published in a magazine called The Pioneer. Manly also wrote his autobiography in a series of articles for a local magazine, the Santa Clara Valley. The articles were entitled From Vermont to California, and they appeared from late 1887 to 1890. These articles are more concise and only lightly edited, and thus have more of Manly's authentic voice. They contain some interesting details not included in Manly's famous book, Death Valley in 49. In 1890, Manly considered putting his story in book form, but was concerned if he self-published. He said that publishers were not interested, so he had to put up the money himself to have it printed. Using From Vermont to California as a starting point, Manly began writing his epic autobiography, Death Valley in 49. I'm sure Manly would be surprised to know the book is still in print and how his story still fascinates us nearly 175 years later. In 1894, Manly finally released Death Valley in 49. He wanted future generations to know the struggles and hardships of the early settlers. In 1895, Manly reunited one last time with his fellow Death Valley hero, John Rogers. Manly traveled to Merced, California, and they had a tearful reunion. John Rogers remained a bachelor his entire life and was crippled and poor. He had read Manly's book and told Manly that, quote, much was left untold. Indeed, Manly wrote, quote, it is fair to tell the reader that the hardest and worst of it has never been told, nor will it ever be. These tantalizing comments are something to note, and I will always remain curious about them. In May of 1900, Manly took another serious fall and he broke his hip. He lay helpless on the ground for a long time before someone came to his aid. Manly's last letter to John Colton is dated March 1901. The following year, in July 1902, Mary Jane Woods passed away. She is likely to always remain a mystery. On February 5, 1903, William Lewis Manly, early California pioneer and hero of Death Valley, finally crossed the dark river he wrote about for so many years. He joined his other Death Valley comrades who trudged across the barren wasteland and into the history books forever. Manly has been an intriguing subject to study for so many years while I wrote my graphic novel, The Man Who Beat Death Valley. After following in his footsteps and reading everything he's written multiple times, I feel like I know the guy. However, Manly has let us all know that no one will ever know his complete story. So he leaves us with a bit of mystery. Thank you for your time and for listening to this video.
We were fools to take the cutoff. We were warned it was dangerous. Instead, we kept going. Straight into a rocky hell. Man Who Beat Death Valley: How Death Valley Earned Its Name, told for the first time in a graphic novel. Order now at debfoxdesign.com.